All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty unique, a tiny but really potent ancient letter, the second epistle of John. And we're going to be looking at it through a commentary by theologian Paul Apple. Now, he argues that this text, and get this, it's small enough to fit on a single piece of parchment, actually contains a huge and super urgent message for us today. So, right off the bat, the commentary tackles this tension that feels, well, incredibly modern, right? It asks a really tough question. When does being accepting and loving cross the line into a dangerous compromise of your core principles? At what point does just trying to get along with everyone mean you've actually given up on what you believe is true? And according to this commentary, this little 13-verse letter gives a really stark, direct answer to that very question. The argument is that some things are just too important to be negotiated away simply for the sake of unity. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so first up, the commentary starts by diagnosing what it sees as a huge problem in modern Christianity. The author, Paul Apple, basically argues that there's this big drift towards unity, which sounds good, right? But he says it's coming at a serious cost, the expense of what he calls doctrinal truth. He specifically points to movements like ecumenism. And the suggestion here is that this whole let's all just get along approach, even if it's well-intentioned, can accidentally lead believers away from what are seen as essential foundational truths. Because it ends up avoiding the more divisive topics. And yeah, he really doesn't pull any punches here. He goes so far as to label this trend apostasy. From his point of view, you can have all this religious sentimentalism that looks like love, but if it ends up denying fundamental aspects of God's truth, well, then it's something else entirely. And to make this point really concrete, the author shares a personal story from his time at Princeton. He talks about how the seminary's theology shifted, and he uses that as a prime example of this rapid doctrinal decline. He's basically arguing that these once solid institutions had, from his perspective, totally gone off the rails. So that begs the question, right? Who exactly wrote this letter, and who was it for? The commentary really stresses that you've got to understand the context here to get why the message is so urgent. Okay, so the letter is from the elder, and the commentary identifies him as none other than the Apostle John. Think about it. He's writing around 90 to 95 AD. He's the last living apostle, which gives his words this incredible weight and authority. And it's addressed to the chosen lady and her children, which sounds a bit mysterious, but the source interprets this not as a literal person, but as a metaphor for a specific local church and its members. All right, now we're getting to the absolute core of the commentary's argument. The author makes the case that John's entire message, everything, hinges on this inseparable bond between two huge concepts, love and truth. So from this point of view, love isn't just some fuzzy feeling. Nope, it's an action. It's actually defined as obedience, walking according to God's commands. And, the commentary argues, that kind of love can only exist inside the boundaries set by truth, the core doctrines of the faith, what's called the teaching of Christ. If you have one without the other, it's just incomplete, it's totally unbalanced. And this quote here from the theologian John Stott, which is cited in the commentary, it just absolutely hammers this point home. The whole idea is that compromising on truth doesn't magically create more love. In fact, it does the opposite. It undermines the very foundation of love itself. Okay, so this naturally brings us to a really crucial question. If love and truth are married like this, then how are believers supposed to respond when they encounter teachings that deny that truth? Well, according to the commentary, the answer is pretty uncompromising. The letter lays down this direct command that, let's be honest, sounds really harsh to a lot of us today. It says you shouldn't offer hospitality or even a formal greeting to false teachers. Now, the source is quick to explain this isn't about being rude to just anyone. It's a very specific refusal to help or lend credibility to people who are actively spreading doctrinal error. And this is what the commentary calls the biblical doctrine of separation. And to show how this doctrine might apply in the real world, the commentary offers up a pre-detailed case study. It actually focuses on the ministry of the late evangelist Billy Graham, arguing that he is a key example of someone who, in the author's view, ignored this principle of separation. So this slide here breaks down the author's entire argument into 4 main points. The claim is that by trying to achieve this broad unity, Billy Graham's ministry essentially erased 4 crucial lines of separation. So from the commentary's perspective, when you do things like accept sponsorship from theologically different churches, or you start to soften the more difficult doctrines, well, those were seen as direct violations of the command we just read in 2 John. So, as you can see, all of this is building toward the final takeaway from the source material. And it circles right back to where we started, that idea of the marriage between love and truth. The author's position here is completely unwavering. In his view, real biblical love requires protecting biblical truth. False teaching isn't just, an intellectual mistake. It's actually described as evil deeds. So the logic follows that if you give any kind of help or welcome to a false teacher, you're actually participating in those deeds. So drawing these firm boundaries, it's not seen as unloving. Instead, it's presented as a totally necessary act of faithfulness. And so the commentary leaves us with this really challenging question, right? It frames a tension that resonates way beyond this one ancient letter. The key thing you should take away from this source is this very specific perspective, a worldview where the highest possible form of love is actually the protection of truth. Even when, and you could argue especially when, that protection requires division.